right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome.
Hey, have you started?
I know that almost everyone in the room here is already an expert on the region. Certainly has spent many years studying, if not living in the region. What I would like to do is just very briefly say why I think Kazakhstan is such an important country in the region. And it goes back to almost the beginning of independence, when our first president, President Nazarbayev, made three decisions that the other countries didn't make at that time. The first one was macroeconomic reform, which will get them on the path towards moving into the world economy. Second was to get rid of all the nuclear facilities in the country. And if you think of the major one that the US helped with in that area, it was the BN 350 fast breeder nuclear reactor in Aktau. And as a result of our collaboration and President Nazarbayev's decision, there was enough highly enriched uranium and plutonium locked down for at least 100 years under AEAE auspices, the United Nations auspices, enough that could have made 750 nuclear weapons if it had fallen into the wrong hands. And then finally, the one that I think is the most important decision of all was the decision to establish something called the Bolashak program, which Bolashak meaning future in the Kazakh language. And what this did was give Kazakhstani students full educational college degree experiences overseas, and a good many of them graduate degrees overseas, so that again, preparing to enter the world as it had become. And there are now at least 15,000, sometimes people use different numbers, but 15,000 alumni of that program who are in positions of leadership in both the private sector and the public sector of the country. So that's why I think we need to pay a lot of attention to Kazakhstan. And we're enormously grateful that Ambassador Dan Rosenblum took time today to spend just a little bit of time with us. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Rushon, who is going to introduce our speaker. Thank you so much.
So welcome everyone to the Caspian Policy Center. I also would like to offer my great thanks for Ambassador Rosenblum to grace us with his time here today and give everyone the opportunity to look a little bit under the hood of US-Kazakh relations. I can't think of anyone more capable than Dan Rosenblum to be ambassador to Kazakhstan. He brings such a wealth of experience from his time in Central Asia as ambassador in Uzbekistan, but for the many, many years when he oversaw US assistance to the region, he has an understanding and I think a textural vision for the region that is really quite unique. And so, Dan, if I may turn the floor to you, I know you want to make some comments and then we'll turn to some questions.
Good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric. And it's a real honor and privilege to be at this table with so many incredibly knowledgeable, as was pointed out, expert people in the region. It's a little intimidating too. I can't get away with anything. I can't just, I'm not going to be able to just say something glib, I have to have substance. But anyway, no, I'm really, really honored to be here. And thank you to the Caspian Policy Center for pulling this together on very brief notice. Most of you don't know that originally I'm only back here for a few days and then I go off on vacation. But originally I was just coming to meet with Eric and Efkan and Dick, just a meeting. And then I suggested, well, maybe we should invite a few more people to join the discussion too. And that's what turned into this. So partly as a result of it happening very last minute, I don't actually have a prepared speech or anything, which is maybe a good thing. My staff didn't write anything for me or any of that anything of that nature. But I'll make just a couple of maybe framing comments about the relationship between the U.S. and Kazakhstan and about what happened over the past year. And then really want to get to your questions, what you're interested in discussing and hearing about. So, by the way, Eric's beginning of his introduction saying he couldn't think of anyone more qualified to be ambassador to Kazakhstan. The only person I can think of more qualified is Dick Hoagland, who's already done it. So, there's probably a few other people at this table who could do an excellent job. But anyway, but thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it. I just wanted to start by saying that I always like to remind myself and everyone that I'm talking to why the U.S. cares a lot about what happens in Kazakhstan and in Central Asia more broadly. I think it's a good starting point for any discussion. And I always start that analysis by looking at the old real estate slogan, location, location, location. And it's become so much sort of a cliche to say, but obviously the place that Central Asia is situated in such a geopolitical, geostrategic seam, it makes it an object of attention for U.S. foreign policy automatically, I would say. Now, those of us who work on the region, and especially those of us who have worked for years on the region, like to think that it has an intrinsic importance to U.S. interests and U.S. foreign policy. And I still believe that to be true. The countries of Central Asia are important to us in and of themselves. But the reality of the way our foreign policy works is the reason why we spend time, resources, and devote attention to it has a lot to do with the location. So I think that we should just acknowledge that as a starting point. And then the question that I always ask is, well, what are our strategic interests? What is our national security interests? And I tend to summarize it in two words: stability and sovereignty. To me, that the main strategic goals we've had really since 1991, since independence for this region, is in ensuring that the countries of the region are stable and do not become failed states that then result in spillover effects that come back to hit us and directly affect our national security. And also that the countries of the region are able to stand up on their own, be fully sovereign and independent countries that can make their own choices about who to associate with, who to trade with, who to have relations with without undue external pressure. So the question then is, how do we help the countries of the region achieve the stability and the sovereignty? And we basically have three main lines of effort, maybe four, depending on how there are different ways of dividing this up. Let me say four to start with. So one is on the political and diplomatic front, where we work to try to find common interests where we can, together with the countries of the region, advocate for certain policies internationally. Probably the best mechanism we have to do that today is the so-called C5+1 diplomatic platform. And I think almost everyone around the table knows something about that, and we can come back to that in the discussion. But the guiding principle behind the C5+1 is that there's a value to the countries of Central Asia acting as a group, integrating with one another, cooperating with one another, and that makes each of them stronger individually. And that's a view that the U.S. shares very strongly. But more broadly, in terms of global issues and global threats and challenges, this one of our lines of effort is making sure that we are as much in sync as we can be with the countries of Central Asia. Most recently, of course, with the COP28 meeting in Dubai on our goals for addressing the climate crisis, we worked very hard with the countries of Central Asia to try to find those common elements. And the most notable example with respect to Kazakhstan was that Kazakhstan signed up, pledged to join the so-called Global Methane Pledge in Dubai. And there's, again, this is an issue we could get more into in the questions, but we actually issued a joint statement with Kazakhstan where we pledged to work together to help Kazakhstan reduce its methane emissions. The second line of effort is in security, and everything having to do with border security, counterterrorism, addressing transnational threats, and helping the countries of Central Asia, and specifically in my interest in Kazakhstan, to be better able to defend itself and to provide for its own security. The third line of effort is the economic one, and that's all about building more trade and investment ties, helping countries and helping Kazakhstan in this case with any internal reforms that it undertakes where we can provide technical assistance and other things to help that be more successful. And the fourth line of effort is, you can cast it different ways. It's human rights, human dimension, governance basket of issues. That one is very active in our relationship with Kazakhstan. And again, I can go into more detail later. But we believe it's essential as part of our engagement with countries of the region, because without good governance and without respect for human rights, there won't be stability and there won't be sovereignty in the long run. So the question is, how did we do in those four lines of effort in 2023? You know, I think with respect to our relationship with Kazakhstan, there was significant progress in all of them in different pace, different areas, but in general, there were some notable achievements. The C5+1 meeting that happened in September in New York was a historic one. This was the first time that the six presidents all met together in one place. I was, to be honest, it was a day that I never necessarily thought I would see. Some of you may know I was involved in the first C5+1 meeting back in 2015 in Samarkand, and you know, we've come a long way since then. A lot has changed in the region, but the fact that we were able to get the leaders all sitting at the table and also issuing a joint statement, which was very substantive and had a lot of specific initiatives, was, I think, an amazing accomplishment. And Kazakhstan, to its credit, has consistently been the catalyst for a lot of that effort and that cooperation. It's not always easy to overcome some of the tensions and the conflicts that exist among the countries and get them all to sit down together. And it takes someone pushing, and Kazakhstan has been that consistent pusher since before 2015. In the security area, you might be surprised if your primary source of information is the Russian media, that in 2023, we moved a whole slew of bioweapons labs from Ukraine to Kazakhstan and established them there. I opened personally a NATO training center in Almaty in October. Yeah, so there was a lot of pretty dramatic things happened in 2023, if that's your source of information. But actually, what happened, and actually, I just share a little anecdote with you that just happened last week. I had a chance to meet with President Tokayev a week ago Friday. He invited 4 ambassadors to have sort of end-of-year tete-a-tetes with him, which hadn't happened before. At least certainly, I don't know if it ever happened while you were there, Dick, but it was the first time my staff were aware of that. So it was the Russian, Chinese, EU, and American ambassadors were invited for separate meetings. But in the meeting, I actually told a similar joke to what I just told to the president. I said, you know, Mr. President, I hope you heard about the NATO training center that I opened in Almaty. And he got it immediately. So he obviously was reading those reports, and then he wanted to talk about what it really was. For those who don't know, there's an international peacekeeping training center in Almaty, which we helped to establish and have supported a lot over the years, and which is training peacekeepers, Kazakh peacekeepers, to go on deployments, international deployments. And by the way, this year they got their first deployment where they're going to lead a mission in the Golan Heights. Maybe the timing's not the best in terms of sending peacekeepers there, but sometime in 2024 they're going to be sending their troops out there. But what we opened in October was actually a conference center that our DoD colleagues had funding for, so we helped to build it. And I was cutting the ribbon on the conference center at the peacekeeping training center, but it became a NATO training center in the Russian ports. Anyway, so a lot to say, I won't go into it again. We can come back to it on the security side. Besides those things I mentioned, in terms of our military to military engagement, and a lot of interest clearly coming from the side of Kazakhstan to deepen its relationship with us in those areas. And well, we can get more into that if you're interested. On the economic front in 2023, our bilateral trade was up significantly. I think we were at $3 billion in bilateral trade in 2022. I've heard, we don't have the final numbers in 2023, but we think it'll probably be about maybe a 15% increase or something like that, which is pretty good. And our foreign direct investment numbers were healthy as well. Another, I think, $5 billion of new foreign direct investment in 2023. We're the number 2 source of FDI after the Netherlands, which is number 1 because of company registrations, I guess, in the oil sector or something. But we're very proud. We're number 2. We try harder. That's what I always say that to the Dutch ambassador in Astana, and he doesn't really get the joke because you have to know about American advertising and rental cars and so on. But in any case, and then we put a big focus in 2023 and began to make progress, I think, together with other partners on developing the so-called middle corridor, the Trans-Caspian route. That was another economic priority for the government and for us as well. And again, we can go into that more if you're interested. And finally, on the sort of the 4th line of effort, the human dimension, depending on how broadly you define that, there was a lot of activity, a lot of exchanges, a lot of educational partnerships forming over the past year. I had a chance to go up to Petropavlovsk in the far north near the Russian border, where Nazarbayev University has a partnership with the University of Arizona. And this past year was the first year of a joint degree program they have for Kazakh students at this university to get an Arizona degree if they go through the 4 years. And we're very excited about a lot of other similar initiatives that there are out there in the educational sector. And on human rights, more broadly speaking, we have this thing we call the high-level dialogue with Kazakhstan between the presidential advisor for foreign policy, Ambassador Kazakhan, and our Undersecretary of State for Human Rights and civilian security. I can't remember the title. Our Uzbekistan, our Undersecretary, that allows us to discuss all these issues, even the most difficult and sensitive issues. The president announced in December a new human rights initiative for the next 2 years that will focus on a lot of issues that we care about, including domestic violence, trafficking in persons, and so on. I think it's fair to say that the one area where we have maybe a difference of perspective and a difference of opinion of where things stand has to do with political competition and political pluralism and the treatment of some people who could characterize as opposition politicians, some of whom are in prison right now. And there's a coalition of human rights groups in Kazakhstan which maintains a list of political prisoners. And as I pointed out to the president, and I've said this publicly too, when I arrived in November of 2022, there were 7 names on the list, which was down. It had been going down steadily, and now there's 23, which is not a good trend. But that said, we also want to give credit where credit is due, and I discussed with the president as well some of the real areas we think are important progress in rule of law and in gender equity, and specifically this issue of gender violence, which has become a focus now in the public and in the legislature. So anyway, I could go on a lot of these topics, but I won't, because I want to, again, talk about the things that you most want to hear and also hear your perspectives.
So I'll take the prerogative of the chair and throw out a few questions to warm you up a little bit. You mentioned the special relationship between the United States and Kazakhstan, and that this has existed since independence. And I would say, we had this culminating moment with the C5+1 meeting, and it's sort of a real high-level policy engagement. But now what? what's left to achieve? Where are we going now? You've reached this pinnacle. Is there more, or is it a denouement?
Good question. I think there is more. The more is in two directions. One is maintaining that level of engagement. So having another leader level meeting.
Okay.
And I know that the Kazakhs are quite interested and pushing us to commit to next UNGA to doing the same thing. It's going to be complicated, I'm sure, because it's an election year for us, and I'm sure President Biden will be quite busy, but hopefully that can happen and then make it sort of a tradition it gets embedded. But also the other thing, which maybe in some ways is more important, is to make sure that the substantive commitments and things that they talked about get realized and grow into other things. So for example, one of the things they announced, there are two things notable. One was the what I think they called it the B5+1, which is a sort of private sector parallel structure of business associations and US business meeting to talk about Central Asia as a regional market and try to, you know, develop opportunities to make that a reality and have the US companies in there. And I think I don't know when the first B5+1 formal meeting will be, but they've already had some preliminary meetings on that. And then the other was a critical minerals dialogue, which was also committed to. This is something it's a big deal for Kazakhstan. I can't speak for, but I know there are critical minerals in other parts of Central Asia as well. And it's something that, you know, we have a very strong strategic interest in. And I'm hopeful that will be something really substantive that we can point to out of this meeting. Actually, the third thing is about the Trans-Caspian corridor, which I mentioned earlier. And importantly, I think President Biden committed in New York that this global thing called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, would prioritize the Trans-Caspian corridor as one of the parts of the world, one of the economic corridors that we would put resources into. So, and just this morning, I met with the office in the State Department that's responsible for PGII to discuss this further and talk about how Kazakhstan can be part of that. So that I think that's the key, is doing real stuff coming out of these.
Good news indeed. So we back here read a tremendous amount about the impact of sanctions on the economies in Central Asia. Kazakhstan has made a very visible effort to comply with the sanctions, US sanctions and international sanctions on Russia. But trade data seems to actually show that there are an awful lot of Western goods that are transiting through Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries onward to Russia. President Tokayev has said that he will keep Kazakhstan in compliance with sanctions, but he's also told President Putin that he will absolutely pursue full cooperation with Russia. Is this possible, in your opinion?
I think it is possible. Just to start with, to put this into perspective, this the goods, the re-export of goods that have some kind of strategic importance. Right now, the US, EU, and UK have jointly come up with a list of 45 categories of goods. They use these harmonized systems codes, they call them HS codes, to identify categories of goods. And these are goods that we believe are dual use and are actually helpful to Russia in pursuing its war aims in Ukraine. And in some cases, if you get down to the level of individual components, these are things that we're finding on the battlefield in Ukraine, you know, some of these components. And it's like semiconductors, but other like ball bearings and other things that are used for military, can be used for military purposes. So those 45, our experts say, make up less than 2% of Kazakhstan's exports to Russia. even if, let's say if they weren't controlling it at all, it would not constitute more than 2%. And so their ability to control or stop, completely any of those re-exports, it's hard to argue that it would hurt their economy or even hurt their ability to say that they're doing a lot with Russia, because there's so many other areas where arguably their economic relationship with Russia is increasing. And just recently they signed this deal for Russia to build these coal-fired plants in northern Kazakhstan, and there's lots of examples of this. So I do think the two are compatible. The difficulty is the challenge, which is not unique to Kazakhstan. We have this with a lot of countries. With Turkey is maybe one of the biggest ones where we have this issue, but it's, we have it with Georgia, with Armenia, with many other countries, UAE, this re-export issue. If you look at the bigger picture, since the sanctions were first imposed back in 2022, Kazakhstan's record, I would argue, is a good one, both in terms of their ability to prevent sanctions evasion using, being a platform for sanctions evasion, and also making sure that they're complying with all the sanctions when it comes to their domestic companies' relationships with Russian companies, Russian banks, and so on. I mean, the best known examples, and many of you in the room may know this, in 2022 and early 2023, there was a lot of effort made to essentially nationalize two large Russian banks that were major players in the Kazakh financial market, Sberbank and Alfa Bank. And in both cases, it was done through very close collaboration between our authorities and Kazakh authorities. And it resulted in them not having a sanctions issue with the Russian financial sector. And then I won't go into other details, but the whole series of other details involving specific companies, and doing business with certain Russian companies and needing to figure out how to continue for the Kazakh companies to continue surviving without violating the sanctions. So they've made a tremendous effort, and we've made a tremendous effort to work with them to avoid that. Specifically on the re-export issue, what's tricky there is that these categories that I talked about, these 45 categories, some of them are pretty broad, and they cover a wide range of goods, some of which it's hard to see how they really are dual use. This is what the Kazakhs argue to us all the time. They're saying, well, can't you narrow it down a little bit and be more specific? Our experts basically say we can't narrow it down because first, we think all of these things have some potential for military use, but also because there isn't a global agreement on what's included in each of these categories. So we need to keep them broad to make sure that things don't leak through. But what we have at the same time said to them is, if you have a problem with some impact it's having on one of your local industries or something, come and talk to us about it, and we can issue licenses, we can talk about carve-outs and things like that to deal with it. So anyway, that as a somewhat convoluted answer to your question, but the bottom line is, I do think President Tokayev's very clearly stated position is a sustainable one, provided that we can continue to work in close partnership with.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
It's a complicated issue, I know, but it is one that the U.S. government has invested a tremendous amount of energy in working with Kazakhstan, and it's been reciprocated. So last week, Kazakhstan announced that it would remove the Taliban from its list of terrorist groups. I guess the question is, why would Astana do this? But more importantly, will this have an impact on U.S.-Kazakh relations?
So, first of all, they gave us advance notice that they were doing this, which is, in the spirit of the partnership of like no surprises. Yeah. From Kazakhstan, I don't want to. I know I shouldn't speak on behalf of another government to explain its positions, so I won't go into any depth on this, except to say that Kazakhstan has made clear that it will not recognize the Taliban government, and remains its position. until there's an international consensus and certain, benchmarks are made. And this doesn't change that. They've also made clear that they prioritize developing some level of economic relations with Afghanistan, even with the Taliban regime in charge there. And they pursue that in a variety of ways, but I think that they probably felt that having the Taliban on this list was somewhat incompatible with this idea of further developing the economic relationship. So again, that's my speculation. I won't speak for them on that. In terms of the impact on the U.S. relationship, I say this as someone who is not steeped in the Afghan policy. So caveating it with that, I would say that we have certain benchmarks that we're looking to achieve in order to move that our relationship anywhere with the Taliban government there, that involves, dealing with terrorist groups, that involves the rights of women and girls, that involves having an inclusive government that's, truly representative of Afghanistan's, diversity, and none of which have been met at this point in our view. And as I said earlier, Kazakhstan basically shares that view, even if they may be willing to go a bit further on some of the economic and commercial ties than we are. And so this move, I don't think will fundamentally affect our bilateral relationship, because the basic principles are still held in common. And I should just add finally that we regularly consult on Afghanistan with all the countries of Central Asia. Most recently, our special representative for Afghanistan, Tom West, that may not be his title anymore. That was the old title. But anyway, but Tom is the guy. He's our point person on Afghanistan. He came to Astana, and they had Kazakhstan Foreign Ministry hosted a C5+1 Afghanistan discussion to kind of compare and policy and synchronize as best as we could. And I think that's becoming a tradition. So I think at least once a year we'll have similar discussions.
Good. So one last question for me, and then I'm going to open it up to the masses here. Kazakhstan is experiencing climate change like few places in the world. In Astana, you were running out of water last summer at a certain point. The Caspian Sea is shrinking. Kazakh ports are at the very shallow end of the Caspian. They're increasing dredging. I mean, it's a very serious set of circumstances facing the entire region, but Kazakhstan in particular is bearing the brunt of this. I don't think anyone can forget the pictures of the dead horses and cattle in Magnitostal from just 2 winters ago. Drought, all of these issues are really at the forefront. And the United States and Kazakhstan, as you mentioned, in terms of COP, have agreed to work together. What concrete kinds of things can the United States cooperate with Kazakhstan on to help alleviate this situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, Kazakhstan, first of all, does have a decarbonization plan. It's pretty comprehensive. Some have criticized it for maybe not being ambitious or aggressive enough, but they basically, I think their net zero target is 2060. They also have more intermediate plans to achieve certain things by 2030, including, having a bigger piece of renewable energy in their mix. I think the goal is to get to 15% by 2030 of renewable energy, something like that. So there's a lot already in place from Kazakhstan's side. And what we have started to do or are doing and have pledged to do more is to work on many fronts to help Kazakhstan achieve its goals. So we have technical assistance through USAID that's focused on this area. Most recently, AID did a a comprehensive assessment of methane emissions in the oil and gas sector in Kazakhstan, as like a starting point, because they need to establish a baseline to figure out how big a problem is before they can measure reductions. But there's a lot of other things AID has in the offing in that area. We also are encouraging our private sector companies that have technologies in this area to look at opportunities to work in Afghanistan, in Kazakhstan. You know, I'll just give you one example of the type of company that I have in mind. So there's this company that's, I think they're actually based in Bethesda, Maryland, that specializes in fixing leaks in gas distribution networks, which there are many, right? Often, especially, you know, some of the gas distribution network in Kazakhstan is quite old. Some of it's new, but there's a lot of really aging stuff. And this company promises that by what they do, they can make significant reductions in losses, which then, you know, the gas that's not lost is essentially found money for the country, for the gas company and for the country. But it also does a lot to reduce methane emissions. And their business model involves, I don't want to even think I'm doing an advertisement. I'm not even saying what the company is, but their business model involves they don't charge the country for the fixing the links, but they take the carbon credits and then they monetize those credits on exchanges. And so that's how they get paid, essentially. So anyway, it's an interesting approach, and that company is currently exploring signing a contract with the Kazakh gas company to do that work. So that's the sort of thing we want to do more. I should also say, by the way, that same company is already doing this in Uzbekistan. The same work. The gas distribution.
Noting that you came from Uzbekistan to Kazakhstan,
Yeah.
I don't know that there's
Well,
any
actually
coincidence.
that is a coincidence, because I didn't have anything to do with the earlier one, but anyway.
All right, I've had enough fun here. I'll ask everyone if you'll state your name and your affiliation before you give your question, now before you had your hand waving.
Thank you. Nalbahor Mamla from the Voice of America. It's great to have you here. You have now closely worked with two reform promising regimes in Central Asia. I think you can answer this question. What major differences and similarities do you see between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan? And also, more directly, is Tokayev really reform-minded? And by that I mean systemic reforms. Do you see the system evolving, changing?
Wow. That's a big question, Nabor. Both parts of it. And I'll try, I mean, I want to give everyone lots of other questions a chance, so I'll try to keep it brief. First of all, it has been interesting to see, you know, the kind of the similarities and differences in two different places. When I arrived in Tashkent, it was already a couple of years into the reform process, and I think, you know, maybe things were slowing down or running into the, you know, the low-hanging fruit had already been harvested, and it was running into more difficult, more complex reforms that involved 2019 when I arrived there. So it was like 2 years into the President Mirziyoyev's reforms. But and so I guess I was there for the slowing down part of it. And I know that was, you know, it was at times frustrating for some people, and, you know, maybe for some felt, you know, like it was a lack of commitment. To me, it was a lot of it was about just, again, running into these things that were more difficult to achieve, not just because they were more complicated, but because there was more resistance, you know, from different parts of the structure. Kazakhstan has a very different history of reform because there's been repeated reforms, and there's probably were some announced when you were there. I mean, it's like, you know, when President Nazarbayev was in charge, I can recall following the region even from more of a distance, that every 3 or 4 years there was some new reform program. And I think, you know, probably each one of them incrementally made some progress, but also left other things undone. And I think that what the things that President Tokayev announced in the wake of the 2022 unrest were focused heavily on the political side. And I think from the government's perspective, most of those reforms have already been implemented. They had to do with constitutional changes, changes in the electoral system, holding the presidential and then parliamentary election. Some of them there are some longer term things that have to do with decentralization, giving more power to the, local government, more resources and more authority to local government. And that's still unfolding. There's a hearty debate internationally, certainly, but even in Kazakhstan about whether the political reforms of that first year were significant or changed anything in terms of the kind of political power balance, so to speak. I do think that the jury is still out and that we have to give some time to see. Of course, one of the most significant things that President Tokayev himself talks about a lot is the 7-year presidential term, the once and only once 7-year presidential term. And you maybe saw that just like a day or two ago in an interview, he was asked about that, and he emphatically said, "I'm done after 7 years, and that's it." The other part of reform in Kazakhstan, economic reform, there was really not a lot. When I got there, there wasn't much focus or talk about it. In September I guess now last year, September 2023, in the president's State of the Nation address, he made it clear that in the coming year, the focus would be on economic reform. And he laid out a pretty ambitious slate of reforms. A lot of them having to do with, it's still, a lot of it is things coming from the state developing the economy. There was some talk about more privatization, but there was less focus on that. There was more focus on developing value chains in certain sectors, protecting domestic producers, but also attracting foreign investment, especially to mining and critical minerals, and setting some pretty ambitious targets for financial sector, like attracting foreign banks to the financial sector and attracting and increasing IT exports from Kazakhstan. So all of those were all elements of the president's goals for the coming year, and it was very economically focused. So it remains to be seen how that's going to all unfold. But I would just say that it's going back to the origin of the question, the beginning of your question. I think the difference is that the reform, the sense of what reform means in Kazakhstan is somehow different, because it's been this kind of repeated effort to change things over time, which has gone to a certain point and not further, as opposed to what was really like a sea change, kind of a watershed in Uzbekistan, where suddenly closed system was opened up. So that to me, that's what feels the most different.
Fair enough. Yes, please.
I want to note that there are other models that look at global warming, and they suggest that Kazakhstan is one of the 7 countries in the world that will benefit most from global warming, going from 1 growing season to at least 2, if not 3. The desiccation problem may be handled by 500 years of technology as that global evolution proceeds. So let's not get too dogmatic there. My question concerns getting Kazakhs to give a damn about their brethren across the border in China. About 15% of the so-called Uyghur detainees are in fact Kazakhs. And the amount of pressure that Kazakhstan could impose on Belt and Road projects to make sure that those people are at a minimum allowed out of the country to join their brethren across the border is tremendous. And yet the Kazakhs seem to be completely prostituted to the OBOR projects. So I need some help understanding that. And if the US can apply any pressure to get the Kazakhs to give a damn about their brethren.
So we do raise this topic in all of our bilateral meetings. Because and so Kazakhstan knows well our view of human rights abuses in Xinjiang and the treatment of Uyghurs and Kazakhs. There are a lot of, as you say, there's a huge number of ethnic Kazakhs living in Xinjiang still. You know, I think it's clear that Kazakhstan feels constrained because of its relationship with China to publicly raising these issues. I don't know, you know, I can't speak for the private conversations that might occur, and there are a lot of private conversations because they have frequent high-level meetings, including President Tokayev and President Xi talking. You know, that the reality of Kazakhstan today is that it's not going to become a public issue for them in their bilateral relationship with China. You know, this is one of those things that we agreed to disagree on, I suppose you could say, between us and Kazakhstan, that we do talk openly about our view of the genocide that's gone on there. You know, then we leave it there. The one thing that I think we have noted, and you know, it may seem inadequate or insufficient to you, is that there are some Uyghurs and also ethnic Kazakhs who are able to cross the border in a variety of ways. There have been, you know, over the years, and who have essentially taken refuge. They don't necessarily have refugee status formally, but they've essentially taken refuge in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan has lived up to its international obligations of non-refoulement. They do not send people back to China. So
As with the Russian soldiers.
yeah, so that's a positive. I mean, in our view, maybe not easy for them in their relationship with China.
Thank you.
So next on my list, Ariel.
Thank you very much. I'm just listening to the previous question, thinking how you're a country of 20 million people, where the neighboring country's senior politicians lay public claims to your territory, and you're going to provoke another neighbor that has 1.4 billion people and is a nuclear power. Just me, sorry. Two questions, if I may. One on infrastructure. You already mentioned water shortages. There are issues with power. What can U.S. as a government and U.S. companies do to expedite the transition to 21st century blend of renewables and traditional energy to address the power deficit, which, by the way, is relevant to Uzbekistan as well, as we know. More broadly, going back to my previous comment on Russian politicians making ridiculous statements on Kazakhstan's territorial integrity, claiming it as Russian land somehow, whatever. As we probably are moving to a new stage in the war in Ukraine, do you see Russia intensifying its involvement in Central Asia, or they just don't have the bandwidth? How China features in that? We remember the important article by Comrade Xi Jinping about Kazakhstan territorial integrity. I think the message was received in Moscow, but you may have an interesting perspective. And just as a personal observation, I think we're lucky to have you in Pakistan. You are
Thank you.
a very, very professional and impressive ambassador. I couldn't
Thank you.
wish for that.
I feel like I should leave at this point. Like, it's all downhill from here. It's only down. Well, thank you, Ariel. So I think it was a two-part question about energy and then about the kind of Russian irredentism or whatever and all that stuff. Yeah, on the energy, I wish I had a straightforward and kind of specific answer I could give you about all the things we could do to help them, fix their energy problems. I know that that one of the biggest short-term problems they have is that their system is so decrepit and there's so much outdated equipment in there, especially in their, power generation plants, that they have they're going to have these recurring winter crises. And after last winter, when the Ekibastuz part of the system completely shut down for a week or something, when it was the coldest part of the winter, they vowed not to repeat that. And I know that they were intensively last summer and in the fall, because I remember meeting with the energy minister like in September or something, right in the midst of this. They were plowing everything into fixing up everything and refurbishing and getting it ready. And they're still having breakdowns and they're still having, power outages and heating outages and so on and so on. So unfortunately, I'm not sure there's much the US per se can do to help with that short-term problem. We have companies that would be, if the government wants to contract with companies that could come in and help them, fix things. And there's also European companies and lots of other companies that can do this sort of thing. But fundamentally, it's about going forward, besides fixing the basic, connective infrastructure for their energy system. And that's not just about the power, it's modernizing the grid so it can use the renewable energy when it comes into the system. That is going to require, state investments. We can't substitute for those investments. Our private sector can be helpful in implementing, but they have to make the investments. And they also, I think one of the key things they need to be looking at is, the World Bank is ready and prepared to invest a lot more in energy modernization in Kazakhstan. And they've been stymied because the government will not provide the sovereign guarantee. Now, there's some financial or there's some policy aspect to this that I don't completely understand because I'm not an expert on these things. Marcia knows a lot more about this than I do, so she can probably explain it. But I know from talking to the World Bank reps in Kazakhstan that they're chomping at the bit to do more, and they've got resources.
Including thermal and nuclear or only renewables?
Including thermal and renewables, not nuclear. I don't think they're interested in doing nuclear. But not coal, but other thermal, with like gas.
Gas is preferable, right?
Well, I don't know about the source of the gas, but gas, yeah. So anyway, so that's what that could be part of the solution. But there's no panacea, and it's certainly not coming from the United States. Although again, we're ready to help, and our USAID colleagues do have an energy technical assistance program in place that could help on things like grid modernization. I'm sorry, I feel like these answers are taking up too much of the time here. But on the question about the sort of territorial, Russia's territorial designs and how Kazakhstan, reacts to that. You may recall that earlier in 2023, I don't remember exactly when it was. I think it was early in the year. There was this incident in Petropavlovsk where a group of, I don't know how to describe them, a sort of a fringe group of people issued a declaration of autonomy, essentially. Like they said, we do not belong to the Republic of Kazakhstan anymore. And this is, we are declaring the, sovereign Republic of Petropavl or whatever. I don't know what they called it, but they, and at the time people thought maybe it was just a joke, and maybe it was more, not to be taken seriously, but the government of Kazakhstan took it very seriously. And just recently, after, you know, a long legal process, the leader of the group was sentenced to 9 years in prison. Another person got 7 years. You know, they really took this down very quickly. So they take these things, as almost comical as they might seem to us, they take them very seriously. I do think that right now, you know, you were talking about if the stalemate continues, and that implies, you know, maybe Russia has a little more bandwidth to turn its attention to other things, possibly. I don't know. At the moment, I don't feel like that there's a sense of any imminent danger or threat to the northern border of Kazakhstan. But after, you know, the February 2022 invasion, you know, how can they not take it seriously, right? As something that they seriously have to prepare for from a national security point of view. So, so I think that's going to continue to be a reality that Kazakhstan deals with. You know, there's always this issue about when statements are made in the Russian, like by some pundits in Moscow or on social media, or sometimes by members of the Duma, about historical lands that belong to us, or gifts of Lenin, I think is the term that they use. These are the gifts of Lenin. You know, how seriously do you take that? Is that Kremlin policy? Is it, you know, does it represent, you know, anything official, or is it just some people, you know, fulminating? And again, I do think that while publicly the government of Kazakhstan is not going to be issuing statements rebutting or responding to all these things, that inside they, you know, this matters. It really matters, and it creates a sense of insecurity and unease that they continue to be dealing with.
We'll have Marcia next.
Thank you, and Ambassador Rosenblum. Well, since the last time we met, I have joined the board of the Caspian Policy Center on the advisory board, so I'm very pleased to see you here, and thank you for accommodating us all. You started by saying location, 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 and in my mind, Kazakhstan will be one of the big winners from this unintended consequence of Putin's war. Because of their location, they're sitting on the route between China and Europe, whether it's coming through the north or whether it's coming through the Caspian in the middle corridor. But recently, as a member of the EAEU, Kazakhstan has also now signed on to a free trade deal with Iran. There was an Astana Times article expounding on the wonderful benefits for Kazakhstan from this arrangement. How will it affect the geoeconomics of the region?
I don't have a really good answer to that. I have to admit, Marcia, how it will affect the geoeconomics. I guess what I'll say is that yeah, there's a lot of more talk I've noticed recently about developing the north-south corridor, which is not new, I realize, but it seems to have risen up again as a priority, and they're signing all these agreements about that, not just the thing with Iran, but sort of infrastructure that's related to the north-south development. And I guess from a very pragmatic Kazakh point of view, they have to look at all those alternatives, not just look at, but develop them. I mean, they see having an alternative to the northern route as essential to their future. And that includes going east to China, it includes going west to Azerbaijan and Europe, and it includes going south. So I understand, and I guess I would say even respect the instinct they have to pursue these things as a landlocked country, et cetera. I will say that, you know, our Kazakh partners have come to us more than once since I've been there and asked some questions about trade with Iran and about oil swaps and various other things related to commodities going through Iran. Because they're just looking for every alternative. And those conversations don't last long because frankly, just where we sit right now, policy-wise, and in terms of sanctions, law, what's in law and so on, there's no flexibility on that. So we we don't get it. We don't even get into the details of it. It's like, as soon as they raise it, I say, sorry, nothing's really changed and we're not gonna, now it's important for them to understand what's allowable and what isn't. And I think they do, or they're studying it more, but to look at our sanctions laws and understand what is sanctionable and what isn't. And for example, there's, as you probably know, there is a lot of trade already, especially like in grain, for example. There's grain loaded in the port of Aktau on Iranian ships that then, bring the grain to Iran. So, and there's other commodities as well. So, that's going to continue, I'm sure. But that does not violate the sanctions, as far as I know. But there are other things that would. So that's
Another thing to keep on your to-do list.
yeah.
And may I
Thank
make a quick footnote there, a historical footnote? The Eurasian Economic Union, this isn't very well known, but it was originally proposed by President Nazarbayev to Putin. And Putin brushed it off for a number of years. And it was only when it was in Russia's interest that he picked up the idea again and then threw it out as a Russian idea. And it was slightly revised so that it was not only a Russian idea, but that it would benefit Russia the most of the members. So actually, this was once again a kind of reform movement by Kazakhstan very early in their independence, but it got sort of twisted around over history.
Turning to this side, Gavin, you had your hand up. I learn right.
I'll follow Eric's call on Gavin Help. Give us Institute of Peace. We've talked a lot about climate change and a little bit about how much Kazakhstan is going to be impacted by climate change in the region. But there's another part of this, which, like any oil exporting country, a good solution to climate change and a green economy is going to leave them without the ability to sell oil that they have in the past to mine it and everything. And thinking about U.S. Sort of strategic needs, and some people are going to roll their eyes in this group because they've heard me say this a lot, but Kazakhstan's got 40% of the uranium on planet Earth. The United States still imports 20% of its uranium, its fuel rods for nuclear power from Russia. So there's an obvious opportunity here to use America's interest and advantage in trying to help Kazakhstan find a role in a post-carbon economy based on the resources that it has. Where is U.S. policy on helping them get more involved in the fuel cycle for nuclear power stations across the world?
Great question, Gavin. Which again, I plead not non-expertise in this area, but I know a little bit about some of the conversations that we've had. As you stated, Kazakhstan currently does not enrich or process uranium at all.
They are denuclearized.
Yes, and so what they export is the yellow cake or whatever, the natural uranium. And yeah, they are, I think, right now, they are the #1 exporter of uranium in the world. And I think they are #2 in reserves or something in the world. I don't know who #1 is actually, but in reserves too? Oh, okay. But yeah. But in any case, they have their own domestic reasons why the enrichment and processing is not an obvious thing to do or an easy thing to do politically. And that they're also running into that with opening a nuclear power plant, which they've been talking about for years and have actually, in the last 2 years, actually solicited bids from companies in China, France, South Korea, and Russia to build that. But in that same speech I referred to earlier, Takayev's speech in September, where he laid out the economic reforms, he also announced in that speech that they're going to hold a referendum on whether to build the plant or not, which really kind of took some people aback. But I believe it's partly a way of drawing out the process a little bit because I don't think the government's quite ready to make the decision of what it wants to do. But that's a separate issue in a way from your question about the nuclear fuel cycle and, you know, what the policy is on allowing Kazakhstan to do that. I mean, the US is grappling with its own set of issues around how we get the uranium we need for our own plants. And right now, we're still very dependent on Russian or fuel that's at least processed in Russia. Some of that is, you know, Kazakh uranium that's processed in Russia. And I don't think my understanding is we have not figured out our own plan yet for how we're going to achieve, you know, sufficiency, or I don't know if self-sufficiency is the right word, but without depending on Russia. And that's partly why, for example, Rosatom has not been sanctioned yet. So it's all kind of linked together. So Kazakhstan wants to know whether Rosatom's going to be sanctioned, because if they are, they don't necessarily want to sign a contract with them to build a nuclear plant. We can't tell them yet because we don't know ourselves, because we're trying to sort out our own supply situation. And if Kazakhstan was already processing and enriching uranium and making fuel rods or whatever, that we could then, that could be our alternative, but they're not. So yeah, so it's a real conundrum inside a riddle, inside a dilemma, or whatever, one of those things. But the one thing I will say is that Kazakhstan's very interested in exploring the small modular reactors that the US is the leading maker of now, although it's a new technology and still unproven. And that tells me that they definitely want nuclear power in their energy mix, and B, that they're recognizing the liabilities they face with Rosatom, and they're looking for alternatives. But it's a tricky mess right now. But actually, maybe to end on a more positive note, I agree with you that it's a great opportunity in terms of developing our commercial relationship with Kazakhstan, and also maybe developing the middle corridor as a route for getting that uranium to market. So
Fair enough. A lot to choose from.
Ambassador, as you know, for ExxonMobil, continues to raise concern about the Caspian pipeline and the security of that route, which obviously takes, I think it's about 80% of Kazakhstan's oil outside of the country, going through Russian territory through the Black Sea. So we continue to see that as a concern, and curious if you see anything has changed in the last 6 months, or how do you see things moving forward? And corollary to that, obviously, there have been additional strikes in Mangistan and other regions in Western Kazakhstan. Just curious if you see that getting worse, getting better, or if there's any progress on that front.
Okay. On the CPC, things seem to have stabilized to some degree, and we haven't had a repeat of these, technical shutdowns that were suspiciously timed, back in 2022. It's maybe it's the lull before the storm, but and I think, well, you can say, speak to this better than I can, but I think from the perspective of the big oil companies, the problems with suppliers and contractors have also gotten better. For those who don't know, a lot of the people providing products and services to keep the CPC pipeline running were sort of staying away or doing hands off because they were afraid of the sanctions risk, and we had to do a lot of massaging and reassuring that they would not be violating sanctions by doing it. So that's all good. The one wild card that came in probably was about 6 months ago, now that you say 6 months, was the attacks in Novorossiysk, the Ukrainian attacks on naval ships in Novorossiysk, which of course is the port where the CPC ends and the oil is taken off. And there was a lot of concern on the part of our commercial partners that was going to be very disruptive to the trade. But again, for now, that seems to have stabilized too. So, but that could become an issue again. Obviously, it's still a war zone, essentially. On the labor situation and strikes and so on in Western Kazakhstan, yeah, there have been a few things cropping up recently. No one that I talked to and the folks on our team at the embassy sees this as the start of like a bigger wave or something that's going to become, like intensify over the winter. But of course, I wouldn't say we have perfect insight into what's actually happening in Mangistau and in Atyrau and so on by any means. But that right now, there's not a lot of like a concern that this is going to become like a series of protests that might lead to something like January 2022.
Thanks.
We've got time for a couple of more questions,
There's one over here.
please.
Atlantic President Ambassador, 25 years ago, fall 1998, that type of challenging time, you presented person from Delta. 25 years from now, what you can think about some most challenging things and some positive achievements?
Whoa. First of all, I remember going the trip to Pennsylvania. Thank you for reminding me. It's been a while since I thought about that. It was my earliest days at the State Department. Well, 25 years from now, I can safely predict that I will not be working on Central Asia policy. Not that that's going to change things in the region in one way or the other, but that's one thing I know for sure. Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to make predictions, especially that far off. Because it's that far off, my inclination is to be optimistic. I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. Because I do believe that fundamentally, Kazakhstan and the rest of Central Asia has tremendous potential to develop its human resources and its natural resources in a way that will benefit not only those countries, but the broader region. And if only the external environment allows it, that it can be a very prosperous and stable place in 25 years. But that caveat is an important one. And I'm just not sure, given what we've seen over the last 2 years from their northern neighbor, that's why I won't predict with any certainty. So that's the best I can do right now.
Any other hands? Please.
I was wondering if you could give us an update on the status of Chinese investment and trade flows in Kazakhstan, especially after the Xi'an summit in May and then Takayev's recent statements about ancient hatred should deter or define our relations with outside powers. A non-toward thing. And this is Wesley from Caspian from the International Tax Investment.
Okay. So yeah, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I know I actually had a meeting with the Chinese ambassador for the first time since my tenure there I want to say it was about 3 months ago or something, 3 or 4 months ago. And he was at the time, crowing about the trade numbers, the trade figures. I want to say they're going to hit 30 billion in bilateral trade this year, or something like that, which is 10 times our trade, which is not surprising. Obviously, neighboring to neighbor and has a lot at stake there. But I think, there's been like Russia, China have been going back and forth as 1-2 trading partners. And in 2021 and 2022, Russia was bigger, but it's quite possible that China will overtake in 2023, as far as I understand. So there's a lot going on there. They just in Xi'an at this Belt and Road Summit, was it an anniversary or a summit? I don't remember what it was, but this meeting that happened, they did sign an agreement. They signed a number of agreements, but one of them was also about opening a new border crossing north of the two major ones that exist now in Dostik and at Horgos. And I know from the Kazakh side, they talked a lot about, being happy and proud that they achieved that, and they think it's important. I think it's one of the interesting things is if you look at the location of this border crossing, and I'm blanking on the name of the city. They express it in terms of the cities on the Kazakh side and on the Chinese side. I can't remember now what that is. That it actually would connect into the railroad networks on the Kazakh side that lead then into the northern route into Russia. So that is not compatible with the idea of developing the middle corridor and the Trans-Caspian, because it doesn't make any sense to send things across that border or that crossing if you're going to go into the middle corridor. But in any case, so the Kazakhs are sort of bullish on economic relations with China. They are not as exposed or as vulnerable, arguably, as other Central Asian countries, because they haven't taken on nearly as much Chinese debt. I mean, if you look at the percent, I think it's less than 5% of their overall external debt is Chinese. Whereas, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, it's much, much higher. They don't see any limits, I guess you could say, on developing that, except that there's a kind of base level of concern about not becoming too dependent on any one partner or any one neighbor. And that's going to apply to China too. So they'll keep this multi-vectoral approach and, diversified approach, but China is going to be a growing economic partner. No question.
So at the risk of overstaying my welcome and asking you questions, one quick
Wait,
question.
how could you overstay your welcome here?
I worry that I'm abusing your generosity to we're keeping you from a vacation. You talked about strategic minerals and the bounty that Kazakhstan has. I know the U.S. Geological Survey has done some work there. I guess the question is, it's expensive to move unrefined minerals, no matter how strategic they are, long distances to the United States. I mean, does the U.S. really have a strategic interest? And if so, how do we realize that with Kazakhstan?
Well, I do think we have a strategic interest, and we've expressed that to Kazakhs. Excuse me. Hold on a second. But you're right that from an economics point of view, bringing the minerals from Kazakhstan to the United States is not simple, and the Kazakhs are very interested in developing the value chain, going up the value chain with minerals as well. So the investments they're looking for from U.S. and other companies, other foreign companies, they want to add on to the investment deals some technologies involving processing. And so, for example, one of the first U.S. companies to get into the market last year, is called Cove Capital. And Cove Capital has been given several I can't remember what they call them, blocks, I guess, that they bid on to develop for certain critical minerals in Kazakhstan. And then the Kazakhs approached them, came back to them and said, we would, in addition to exploring these territories and possibly extracting the minerals, we would also like you to come in on a deal for this major processing facility in another part of Kazakhstan. So this seems to be their approach. And I think under those terms, there's potential for other U.S. companies to get involved. I was in Arizona about 4 weeks ago. For those who don't know, Arizona has a special relationship with Kazakhstan that goes back 30 years. The State National Guard in Arizona has this regular mill-to-mill engagement, and it's sister cities, and it's expanded. I think earlier I was talking about the University of Arizona, and so at many levels that exists. So that's why I went to Arizona. But when I was there, I did a roundtable with businesses, including the large mining company, Freeport Moran, and other mining companies. And there was a lot of interest. I was actually blown away by the level of specificity of their questions, which indicated to me that they really want to explore the market in Kazakhstan. So anyway, so I see potential there despite the difficulties.
All right, fair enough. So we have a question from the internet. I was going to ask this one earlier, but I figured it was going to get asked in the room, so we will go to the internet for it. What can the United States do to assist Kazakhstan and to develop this middle corridor?
So, the key challenge to develop the middle corridor and make it a viable alternative is to increase the speed of goods moving and to lower the costs. Obviously, those are the two elements to make it competitive. And that will require the countries of the region cooperating and harmonizing their standards and their procedures for the movement of goods. So other than encouraging that to happen, which we have been doing and will continue to do, and sometimes even, maybe brokering some, not maybe brokering is the wrong word, but encouraging countries to talk to each other to reach the necessary agreements. That's really the countries of the region that have to do that. So, and it's primarily Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and to some extent Turkey that have to reach those agreements. But what we can do is work on the infrastructure that's necessary to also facilitate the movement of goods. And there's hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. There was for those who obsessively follow the region, you might have seen this already, but EBRD did a study back in June. They released it in June of this year on how to make the middle corridor economically competitive. And they identified 40 projects, 33 hard infrastructure, ports, railroads, roads, other things related to actual tangible hard infrastructure, and 7 soft infrastructure projects. We are already working on some of the 7 through some of our technical assistance projects, USAID, and also CLDP, our Commercial Law Development Program, Commerce Department is engaged on those things. On the hard infrastructure, there's a lot of interest on the part of the international financial institutions. Of course, we're voting members, so we can encourage those and push for those. And also the European Union has a huge interest and stake in that. The EU is hosting a conference in late January in Brussels. They're calling it an Investors Forum for the Middle Corridor, or maybe they have a different term they call about Global Gateway, and they have this thing which has resources behind it, but I think it's Middle Corridor in this case. And the U.S. will be there, will be sitting, as participating in that forum. And the hope is that countries will actually make pledges towards specific projects at that event. And then finally, I'll mention, I don't remember if I said this earlier, because just before I came here, I did another roundtable at the U.S. Kazakhstan Business Council. So I may not have said this here, but did I mention Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment? Okay, so I did the PGI. So PGII is also, as I said earlier, is committed to marshaling resources to support infrastructure on the middle corridor.
I would just note the World Bank study was great. They're talking about crossing the Caspian and whatnot, but actually all of its work was focused on Central Asia proper and really didn't get across the water.
Yeah. Well, so actually there are 2 studies I didn't mention. So the first one it was not World Bank, it was EBRD, but World Bank also did a study that's more recent. And I think they looked at the whole thing. And actually, I haven't read the World Bank one yet. I did read the EBRD one, but I'm told that it's a little less bullish on the prospects for the competitiveness of the middle corridor than the EBRD one is, but I don't know why, but in any case.
That's grist for your next talk here in Washington on your next visit. I'd like to thank you for coming and speaking with us, Ambassador Rosenblum. Always insightful and always useful for all of us. Thank you and bon voyage for your vacation.
Thank you. Thank you all.